Firstly, my historic context is that I'm very international, born in Croatia, marrying a Serbian as a Croat, moving to England, naturalizing there, working in pastoral ministry for 11 years, studying there my BA, MA, and PhD at King's College eventually in human rights and social justice. And then publishing the book on human rights, on role and rights to women and to poor and to the race relations issues that I've considered in different chapters of that book, The Silent Church, and then since then in many, many articles and other books in which I published those issues. So that's my general context. I'm an educator. I was a pastor, and I'm still ordained clergy and pastoring, preaching, but mostly what I do professionally nowadays is teach. I was chair of religion department on the East Coast in Maryland at Columbia Union College for 16 years. And then about 6-7 years ago, I moved to California, where I teach mostly ethics and religion, particularly bioethics, because I work within the context of medical university. The university has a variety of healthcare sciences, 8 schools of healthcare sciences. And so that creates for me a new context. Some of you are advocating, some of you are artists and fighting on the edge of art to express yourself. Some are in politics. I predominantly try to influence people. And why I said all of this is for different reasons. Firstly, my audiences are usually students or former students. So I've trained a lot of ministers who are now pastoring large churches all around the world, Australia, America, England, etc. I have an audience of colleagues whom I studied with and also worked with in pastoral ministry in England, in UK in general, and in Europe, in some of the parts of the Europe that are beyond that. Recently, I was in Norway 2 years ago doing a whole 2 weeks of meetings with pastors and lay people, talking to them. And so my influence has been in trying to educate people to be more aware of the needs of the other, the widow, the orphan, the alien, the underdog, the marginalized, those who have no voice. And we need to raise voice on their behalf, as it was mentioned from Proverbs 31 and verse 9. And so as I look at social media myself and truth-telling, I'm fighting or I am influencing continually those people, students, former colleagues, but also relatives. And, when you start talking about truth-telling and when your own relatives from around the world have very different viewpoints and opinions, gets even more complicated than when you're just trying to persuade people beyond that kind of narrow influence. Recently, there have been fights on social media among our own family members because of the perspectives and the truth as people see it, or lack of truth as they see it. So I'm saying social media becomes this platform that is many things. I want people to see that I'm baking sourdough starter bread, as well as advocating for social justice. And how do you do that one after another in the posts? It's a very confusing and very difficult thing at times, because it's not monolithic, it's not homogenic, it's a very, very complex polyphony of perspectives, voices, and issues that we are constantly expressing. So that's my struggle and my continual confusion on how to best do that. So that's personal disclaimer and personal history. But then we also need to have historical context of the issues that we are facing. National or world movements, signs of the new raises in fascism and extremism. And then we need to look back at the history, as I again, in my book, I addressed, and in consequent chapters and articles, issues of Nazism that is so close to many of us, because some of us, I'm of a German descent, and so the issues of Nazism have been present and studied in a kind of post-Holocaust ways, but I think that they need to be resurrected lest we forget, because it seems that some of these sentiments continue coming up not only in America, but in Europe, in a very, very uncomfortable ways. And so knowing history, historical context, what we believed we were fighting against in the sense of a Christ-centered life should be re-examined, rethought, and a lot to learn and some of the things to unlearn. So that's my first point, historical context. And then even going back beyond the history of recent times, look at the biblical history. In what sense have refugees, hatred for minorities, issues of the people who are marginalized been presented and represented through the prophetic voices in the Jewish scriptures, in the Old Testament, and in the prophetic voices of the New Testament, of Jesus as someone who is the primary example for us to know how to go about living our kingdom of God sentiment today. So, even people in the ancient times, in biblical times, were reluctant to refugees. But now we look people like babies jailed, internment camps that are happening. And being informed is a very important aspect of telling the truth. So historical context. Secondly, and it was mentioned before, critical thinking. Again, as an educator, I struggle when I see people with so little critical thinking posting or thinking in the way that their politics or the sources of what they are listening to is in some way informing them and not exercising the critical thinking. People with masters, I have colleagues and friends who studied with me, who are posting things that are beyond belief. And sometimes I'm just perplexed. How can that happen? Where is their critical thinking in the process of what they see and what they post? And maybe I need to think also about myself. Am I exercising critical thinking? Am I doing Socratic, Platonic, the unexamined life is not worth having and not living? And therefore, am I continuing to examine and think critically? Because you see, as the matrix, for those of you who are, you mentioned so much postmodernism and postmodernism and postmodernism and post-secularism that has been very heavily in Europe, and in America we haven't yet smelled the coffee how much it's actually penetrating our culture, and it is hugely. But it's that film, The Matrix, in which again the Platonic ignorance is a bliss came so powerfully to us. Ignorance is a bliss, but actually I don't want to choose that pill. It seems that a lot of people are choosing that pill and thinking that that's harmless, but ignorance is actually taking lives. When people are out of ignorance speaking, and this has been just recently, again, in articles in New York Times and Washington Post and LA Times and others explored here, The Observer, The Independent have had articles on this, on how some of the media that is giving us those ignorant kind of aspects are really resulting in more people dying from, for example, COVID-19 because of the ignorance, and the ignorance that is perpetrated through news, through media channels. And the study, something that we should really look at very carefully at. So at what cost do we allow ignorance to be a bliss? And at what cost should we fight for the truth telling that will disperse ignorance and hopefully save lives of people who are just living in that kind of context of ignorance? Thirdly, truth telling. We talked about truth, and it's important. That's the crux of the subject, so that's why it's in the middle. Firstly, we need to have truth findings, and that is difficult today. When we talk about Jesus equals truth, that is true. Jesus equals love as well. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, 60, 70 years ago, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And it seems to me that we need to be continually seeking who Jesus is in order to espouse to that kind of truth. Because we've domesticated Jesus. We've done it in Europe. And that's why Nietzsche was kind of, critical of that process. If you look at the kind of philosophical trajectory and the death of God movement in the 60s and whatnot, as Herman said, even today, that's kind of still very, very prevalent. What have we done with Jesus? If we have created Jesus in our own image, so he's some kind of gun-loving libertarian, maybe we need to re-examine who is Jesus Christ for us today in 2020. And that way we could maybe replicate more of a biblical Jesus. And that means that we try to shed that layers of the onion of what we've created onto Jesus with the church, with the tradition, and find the real Jesus of the narrative of the biblical texts, of the Gospels, etc. So search for real and not inauthentic or fake Jesus. I want to also mention another point, and that is nationalism. Issue of nationalism is huge in Europe and in America. In America, incredibly. It is a problem, and it has always been a problem of wars and disrespect of other human beings, when we have elevated nationalism to our first primary identifying mark. I am a Croatian. I'm also British because I have pledged the allegiance to the Queen and her government and am a British citizen, Hedda. I'm also 20 plus years in America and have assimilated and accumulated and also pushed back to that culture. I'm also male. I'm white. Are those identifying marks primarily for me, or is my belonging to the kingdom of God my first and foremost identifying mark? And that changes everything. If I am a Croatian, if I am white, male, British, American, whatever, first, that means that will color everything else that I have to say or seek or understand or even argue with. But if indeed my first allegiance is to the kingdom of God, then all of these other things are something that are given to me, or I have chosen them, but they're only part and parcel of that larger reality of me being a member of the kingdom of God, and therefore member of Jesus's movement. And that identity will shape how, and not only what, I will say in the truth telling. So finally, the last point, heroes. Who are my heroes and why? We need to be virtuous people, but what is virtuous or good life in 2020? It is replicating the traditions that I espouse, that I love, that I appreciate. And I'm looking at statues going down and people having different heroes here and there. And then that is making me ask, who are my heroes and why? And how can I be more like my heroes? And here is one of them. How can I live with integrity? How can I live the radical Christian life? Not domesticated Jesus following, but radical Jesus following. How can I have courage? And that's very often the primary virtue that I'm seeking, because I see that I'm too many times very timid and too lacking in courage to speak truth to people that I know, not to the powers. To powers I can speak easily because they're outside, but people whom I loved and respected and still love in a Christian sense, but whom I vehemently disagree with and whom I cannot believe are saying what they're saying. How do I go at that with them? And here's how I will do it. I'm finishing with a quote, like a number of you did, of one of my heroes. I mentioned him already, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's not the only one, but I'm focusing again and again now in the last 3 to 6 months on reading back Dietrich. And I found through a friend a very important quote from his letter to his brother. He wrote to Karl Friedrich Bonhoeffer in 1935. Remember, 1935, way before the Second World War. the following. The brother was concerned about the younger brother, Dietrich, being too radical in the confessing church and the negative exposure it was giving him. And so this is what Dietrich wrote. Perhaps I seem to you rather fanatical and mad about a number of things. I myself am sometimes afraid of that. But I know that the day I become more reasonable, to be honest, I should have to chuck my entire theology. When I first started in theology, my idea of it was quite different, rather more academic probably. Now it has turned into something else altogether. But I do believe that at last I'm on the right track for the first time in my life. I often feel quite happy about it. I only worry about being so afraid of what other people will think as to get bogged down instead of going forward. I think I'm right in saying that I would only achieve truer inner clarity and honesty by really starting to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously. Here alone lies the force that can blow all this hocus pocus, in brackets, of Nazism sky high, like fireworks, leaving only a few burnt out shells behind. These things do exist that are worth standing up for without compromise. To me, it seems that peace and social justice are such things, as is Christ himself. I end on Bonhoeffer's quote. I hope I can replicate it. I can get courageous to speak truth, not only to the powers, but also to the friends, to former students, to colleagues in ministry, to churches around me, etc.